Good morning, everyone, or good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thanks for being here. It's me, Ari Dotset, Connor Sheet. I'm your anthropologist and sociologist. Please hit the like button, share this live stream, subscribe to the channel, become a member of the channel, and don't forget, you can donate the links below. And please check my novels on Amazon. Thank you very much. Today, I'm going to address the topic of Islamophobia. What is Islamophobia? Okay, let me just give you a definition of Islamophobia. One moment. One moment, about to show it on the screen. One moment. Okay. Islamophobia, an intense dislike or fear of Islam, especially as a political force, hostility or prejudice towards Muslims. Here's another definition that explains it well. Fear, hatred, and discrimination against practitioners of Islam or the Islamic religion as a whole. The term appeared as Islamophobia in French literature in the early 20th century as a designation for anti-Muslim sentiments and policies. It was popularized in English in the late 1990s. Islamophobia is a type of xenophobia, or fear of foreigners or foreign things. Some scholars have argued that it should be considered synonymous with anti-Muslim racism, since the effects of Islamophobia on the lives of individual Muslims and the attitudes of those holding Islamophobic views are closely comparable to those that result from racism. All right. Okay. You can read Islamophobia is an extreme fear and extreme fear of and hostility towards Muslims and Islam, which often leads to hate speech, hate crimes, as well as social and political discrimination. It can be used to rationalize policies such as mass surveillance, incarceration, imprisonment, and disenfranchisement, and can influence domestic and foreign policy. Okay, so there you have it. A phobia is when you feel threatened without any justification. Okay. Phobia. Okay. Here it is. Phobia. It's from ancient Greek, which means phobos, which means fear. It's used in nouns pronounced fear for a specific thing. For example, claustrophobia. In this case, is an example. Used to form nouns meaning hate, dislike, or repression of a specific thing, like homophobia, xenophobia, chemophobia. Well, let's continue. Here, a phobia. Allow ads. An irrational fear, horror, or aversion. Fear of an imaginary evil or undue fear of a real one. So a phobia is when an individual is afraid because they believe they're in danger or they're threatened, while there is no actual danger, or where it's questionable whether danger even exists. That's a phobia. You have various phobias in the world. Now, today we talk about Islamophobia. Now, to show you that the United Nations has noticed a rise in Islamophobia. As you can see over here, an article from 5th of March 2024, that's earlier this year. And they even had meetings about it. And you also had that in 2023, anti-Muslim violence increased in the United States. Also, the war in Gaza, the genocide going on in Gaza also had an effect on it. And also, you have since the October 7, 2023, or the 7th of October 2023, people who are associated with Islam has faced more incidents of violence. than before. And so this is something worldwide. Now in India, India had an issue. In India, there was an issue against Muslims for a long time. It goes back to the colonial times also. This from 2017. So India is another case. But in general, even the world's leaders agree there's a rise in Islamophobia. Okay, so let's look at the Muslim world, also called the Ummah. And this is an estimation of 2022 of how many percentages of countries are Muslim or identify as Muslim. Now, as you can see, the overwhelming majority of the Ummah are in Northern Africa, what we call the Middle East, we used to be Africa too, Central Asia, Indonesia. Indonesia is the #1 Muslim country in the world, Bangladesh, and also the Balkan states in Europe. Oh, Suriname is also quite big in it. So that's where most of the Ummah live. Now, when you go to, let's say, Western Europe, it's between 1 till 15% of the countries that identify as Muslim. So they're still a minority. So why is there such a right towards Muslims? Now, as a sociologist, I want to know what are the group dynamics in society or in a community, and what can explain group behavior. As an anthropologist, I look at the root philosophy on why those dynamics even exist. Now, I'm both an anthropologist and a sociologist. And based on sociology, I can tell you now that there shouldn't be any fright towards Muslims in the Western world. Now, it would be understandable if that would exist in Southeastern Europe, where they have a majority in some of these countries over here. But we're talking about the West over here, also United States and other places. Now, from a sociological point of view, we need to understand that collective phobias have a purpose. Now, it's a dysfunction that a lot of people share the same phobia, absolutely. But this dysfunction can become a political tool for a society. For example, um, if you have this phobia for foreigners, well, that's a big dysfunction, a psychological dysfunction a lot of people share in the country. But now politics can use that to solidify nationalism or to enforce policies that actually end up profiting the rich and wealthy. So, just like any phobia, there is something people are avoiding. Phobias don't just develop. I'm not talking about phobias individually. I'm talking about phobias collectively. Collective phobias don't just come up like that. A collective phobia is always the result of denial. There is something people don't want to face nor deal with. People are actually better set on the run. But here's the issue. Because they, as a population, can't just escape all the time or move away all the time. I mean, they're their lives in a location. They need to deal with whatever it is they don't want to deal with. But because they don't want to deal with it, it brings out a lot of stress in them. So what's the result now? They now begin to look for someone to associate their stress with. And once they find a group of people they can associate their stress with, it's going to become easier to falsely attribute their stress to those people. So now they will pretend like it's those other people that's causing them stress. Even if objectively all the proof shows that that's not the case. But at this point, people don't care at all about proof. Only thing on their mind is that they are in unrest. It's caused them psychological problems. It caused them difficulties in daily life. They want to get rid of all the difficulties and be at ease again. So the way to do that is to discharge their unrest. They just want a group they can blame for their unrest so that whatever it is they're not facing, they can continue to escape from it. That's what collective phobia is all about. Whether it's xenophobia, so phobia against Chinese people, whether it's there are all types of phobias out there. There's also Russophobia, I believe, these days, phobia for Russians. But anyway, now we understand what collective phobia is, and that it serves the purpose of keeping the public at ease. But this only works if people don't mention the topic they're avoiding. Because the moment you mention the topic people are avoiding, the relief seeking by violating the other group will not work anymore. It's a type of black magic, collective black magic, in which the population puts a spell on themselves, in which they end up believing, despite proof contrary, that it's the other group that's causing their downfall. So it's a victim spell they put on themselves. So in a collective phobia, the public collectively puts a victim spell on themselves. And eventually they begin to believe that they are the victims. But then, when scholars or researchers come with actual proof to challenge their belief that they are the victim, people become defensive because the proof actually makes them look bad. And because they don't want to look bad, they will hold on even tighter onto the false belief that they are the victims. And eventually, it will lead to a longing for a political tyranny. Whenever there's a phobia in a population, that means when they are projecting their unrest onto another group, eventually people will long for strong censorship on the truth. The truth is, it's not that other group, whoever the group is causing you guys to be dysfunctional and in unrest. Unless the other group is politically oppressing you or also financial oppressing you, then you cannot blame the other group. But if it's your own group that's dysfunctional and lacking, but you don't want to admit it, now you don't want this to be discussed. So now you want censorship on this. So anytime there's a phobia in a society or in a country or even a small community, the longing for censorship will increase, and eventually people will long for a tyrant or a dictator to enforce the censorship. Because as long as the censorship is there, nobody will be confronted with reality, and everyone can be at ease. While they victimize the other group as a sacrifice because they don't want to be stable. So the question becomes, what is it that the quote unquote Western world and some of these other countries are not facing about themselves? Again, the majority of Muslims are not even in the West. All right, so what is it? Here you got it. The declining birth rates. Rashid, what are you talking about, man? How can declining birth rates lead to Islamophobia? Well, okay. Okay, let's see. This is now. There's not much data available from Latin America for some reason, some African countries. Also from Japan and Korea, there's not much data over there. But you can see the Ummah or the Muslim world is mainly Northern Africa and big portion of Africa also, and Central Asia and the middle, what we call the Middle East. Okay. Now, remember this image. Now we're going to this image over here. Let's put them side by side. So the blue refers to a negative birth rate. So that means that there are not enough children being born to replace the current generations. And the red means they're doing well. Well, as you see here, Africa overall is doing well, except Tunisia for some reason. Okay? The middle, what we call the Middle East overall and Central Asia doing quite well. But hold on a minute, let's go over here. Do you see it over here? Middle East, Central Asia, Big portion of Africa. That's where the Ummah, the Muslim world, is for the most part, besides Indonesia. And look at this. Those are places with the highest birth rates. This does not mean that everyone that lives in these places is a Muslim. Absolutely not. There are Christians over there, there are people that belong to other religious groups. So, but just know that the Ummah or the Muslim world is doing a good job having big families. While the West, South Korea, Spain, Poland, Ukraine, also the Netherlands, Canada, they're declining. And one thing you need to understand, if you have no children as a population, you go extinct. Now, it will always happen that some people won't have children, either by their own choice because they have an issue against having children because they don't want to be responsible. They just want to escape, have a lifestyle of child-free without any responsibilities. It's kind of it's kind of narcissistic that because a lot of these people, I'm not saying that everyone who does have children is narcissistic. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that whole idea of not wanting to have children because you don't want to be bothered is narcissistic in itself. Why? Because those same people often who don't want to have children do have complaints when others raise their children. Because later, when they're quote unquote older, they have to deal with the behavior of the new young people. So they want others to have children and raise them the way that suits them and their gender, but they themselves want to contribute. If you refuse to have children yourself, why the hell do you want to decide how others raise their children? Why complain about the youth if you're not contributing to the youth yourself? Not even as a step parent, whatever, or a foster parent. I get the hell out of here, y'all. But anyway, what I'm saying is that without children being born, you have no guarantee for anything. Okay, let's say you are, let's take for example Louis Vuitton or Armani or Versace or any of these brands, luxury brands. They need people to purchase their goods for them to remain relevant. Where does people come from? They're born. If you have a lower population with lower economic activity, then you have less people with wealth able to afford those luxury goods. There goes your luxury businesses. Okay, let's say you are invest in real estate and you you and your team construct all these beautiful apartment complexes. But guess what? You need people to rent those places. Where does people come from? They either migrated to your place or they're born locally over there. What if there's not a high migration rate and there's a low birth rate? Guess what? You have a high probability that those apartment complexes you've built will turn to ruins naturally. Why? Because there aren't enough people born to grow up to end up renting in those places. Should I continue? What about universities and educational institutions? You need people to enroll as students in order to graduate to keep your university of quality and relevance. But what if there are not enough people born? That means a lot of universities and colleges are going to be empty. In Japan, many primary schools have been demolished because there were not enough children born locally to attend those primary schools. There were even high schools that were demolished. Hold on. I don't know what the heck this is, but okay. Where is it? Okay, I'm here. So let's think about um, healthcare or hospitals. Where do you get nurses and medical doctors? They have to be educated in those in universities. But guess what? Where are the university lecturers coming from? They were educated too. Where they come from, they were born somewhere. You get what I'm saying? A low birth rate means less people in almost any relevant profession. primary professions. I mean, like medical doctors, bakers, construction workers. I mean, let's say there's a big city with skyscrapers. Let's say you have a city with 5 million people living in it. 20 years later, there's only 3 million people. That means a big portion of the city is now empty, abandoned buildings. What if later it's going to be 2 million people? And because the population is declining, you have a lot of these empty buildings, you have more criminality, more drug dealing. Because if you have all these empty places, they can't all be policed all the time. It's easier to misuse them for child trafficking, drug trading, or prostitution, or whatever. So I hope it's clear to you now that you need a stable population growth to keep your nation or your community going. This is actually something primary. So any community or any country in the world that's realistic would prioritize the youth to make sure the youth is protected. Especially, they would motivate and push for the youth to even be there. Any country or community that tolerates lifestyles to become popular, or that even encourages lifestyles where um, having children and look after the next generation is excluded, they're out of their damn minds. A country needs a population to govern. That's why it's a country. A country without a population is just a bunch of weirdos in some building claiming to be kings or claiming to be governing, but you need people to govern. I mean, anyone can go to a forest with no human population, claim that they're emperor or a king, whatever. But there's no population. Well, that looks quite silly, isn't it? A country without a population to govern, what is that? It's just an empty claim on paper. Countries are real in the sense there's a population that needs to be governed. So any country that has realistic policies would facilitate big families and it would promote that. So, what happens when countries do the opposite? They go against reality. They focus on financial exploitation more than on, you know, community building. Guess what happens? You're going to have an aging population. You're going to have less children born because either a lot of them are aborted before they're born, or simply the pregnancies never happen because people sexual activity declined also because of work or other stress related issues. So what happens now is that you have a population that's getting older and older, often getting weaker and weaker also because their lifestyles were not in harmony with the will of the Heavenly Father. So now you have a growing aging population that's going to be costly to maintain, and you don't have enough young people to both financially and logistically look after all these older people. And now the younger generations will become resentful. So they go, hold on a minute. We have to look after all these people who didn't even want us to be born, a lot of them, who didn't even want to contribute for the next generation, only think about themselves. And they have the nerve to demand us to be respectful, to have manners, all that. Well, they didn't even contribute that much. They only took, and took. And that is the generational conflict that goes on in the Western world right now. That's why you had this cultural phenomena in which a lot of people begin to complain about Generation Z. They were complaining about the boomers and complaining about Generation Z. Why all these generational conflicts? Now you know why. And rightfully so. Why would the newest generation, which who've just been on Earth for, who've just grown into adulthood, why would they have to carry the loads of the neglect of the previous generation? And the previous generation were still alive to even own up to their wrongdoings. No generation owes you anything, are things they tend to say. What the hell? So if no generation owes you anything, why should the current young generation owe something to the older generations then? Now, this issue of declining birth rates is a very sensitive issue because it would require people to give up some of the liberties that they take for granted. It would require people to focus more on family and social relationships instead of status and financial gain. It would require people to give up a lot of the escapisms they're used to and to accept community obligations. Now, are people willing to do this? Often not. And one thing you need to understand, when you facilitate narcissism in a population to such an extent that people even believe they have a right to neglect the rest of the community, when you want to reverse this, you're going to face a fight. And some of these people are older and they're unable to do a proper contribution. So even if they would change now and repent late in life, they still cannot undo the damage they've contributed to, and they still cannot do a proper long-term contribution now. So what are you going to do with those people? They're still going to be around. A lot of them are going to be upset with the new policies that are focused on the family. Why? Because if you have a lot of these older people who never contributed to the next generations, they never had children or they never participated in developing healthy families in the community, if they were always going to the job, making their cash, and escaping, now that they're older, they've become irrelevant. Because what matters is you need babies to grow up into the young adult generation to keep the country going. So who becomes relevant now? The people who either did have children or have grandchildren right now, or the people who are in the young phase forming families. They become the priority. That means all these older people who were quote unquote child free or who were quote unquote living their life, whatever that means, they're now irrelevant. And because they're irrelevant, they don't have much to say anymore. And they're going to feel a certain way in a negative about that. And the younger people are going to say, well, Donovan, why should you be relevant? You had your chance to contribute. You didn't. So what I'm saying is that the Western world and some of these other places in the world, they have this big problem right now. And there are no easy solutions for it. There are none. So what happens now is that these places will have a population decline, with many elderly people which will not all of them, but a lot of them will be in a bad condition. And then we have Africa and to some extent Central Asia, where you have a high birth rate, and the young peoples in the future young people of those nations will be needed elsewhere. But that also means now that African people in general, as well as people with Islamic background, are going to become more and more relevant. And with them become more relevant, they have more to say. So that means that in the future, it's going to be mainly African people or dark-skinned people, as well as people with an Islamic background, they're going to have the say when it comes to finances, politics, economics, culturally also. And that means that the native peoples or the locals of these countries will have less and less to say in their own homeland. Oh, and do not forget that when it comes to the West, that these countries don't have such a lovely history when it comes to the rest of the world. Let me talk here. Talk about colonization, slavery, and all this other stuff. And don't forget, you have a place like Argentina that used to have a local black population, local population of African descent, and around a third of the country was what you can consider black around 1800. That's before independence, but still part of the Spanish Empire. But now today, um, Argentina is considered a quote unquote white country. They refer themselves as a European nation outside of Europe. How did this be? How did it come into being? What happened to 1/3 of the country being from African descent? And now suddenly it's a European nation. And there was even a president one time who claimed that blacks do not exist in Argentina. It's a Brazilian problem. Yes, there was a genocide in Argentina. And they also imported millions of Europeans in the 19th century. It was called the process of branqueamento in Portuguese. That means whitening. That means they pushed for the colored peoples or dark-skinned peoples locally to marrying white women or white men. Well, what they consider white men. I mean Europeans. I mean those terms, black and white, are political terms, but you get what I mean. They encourage this ethnic mixing to make the country become more lighter skinned. Because they wanted to look more like Europe. Yes, that's what's going on. They happen in Brazil, Cuba, and many other places. And well, that process that happened in Latin America and some other places in the world is being reversed now by this. It's now being reversed, which means that, let me go back to, hold on. Where is the map? Okay. Which means that places like Australia, New Zealand, and United States of America, Canada, were often perceived as being European countries, which actually they're not. You just had a large European migrant population over there. They now will be more and more colored countries. And even places in Europe are going to be more colored. And that is the big cause of this Islamophobia. It's a fear of extinctions of the European diaspora and European indigenous people. And it's also the fear of losing narcissistic lifestyles because the family will become the norm again in the future, slowly but slowly. This whole toxic individualism that the West promoted will be something of the past very soon because it simply cannot be afforded anymore. As a matter of fact, the European countries were making incentives over and over again to push the population to have more children. But often it just fails. There's one thing you need to understand about family formation and extended families. The nuclear family is not enough. You need extended families. One thing to understand about extended families is that you need to have a heritage to build on and to pass on to. The Western world, what, I want to say like this. When you raise children, you raise them into something. You don't just teach them the basics, brush your teeth, wash yourself, wipe yourself after you go to the toilet, and then this is how you read or write, and that's it. And they could just figure it out all by themselves. No, you socialize children into something where they will develop their adult identities. That's how it works. So you need to have a sustainable heritage that you can hand over to the next generation. Something that's sustainable. Question being, does the Western world and a lot of these other nations in the world that went along with the West, do they have sustainable heritage or do they have a sustainable culture? Well, you can answer the question for yourself. If they had a sustainable culture, you wouldn't have declining birth rates right now because people would be motivated to bring forth more of their own. People will be motivated to have extended families to share the sustainable heritage they have. So what comes down to is that Islamophobia is a diversion. So Western people, and to some extent also people from Eastern Asia, don't have to look at themselves and admit that they failed to keep a sustainable culture. That's what it comes down to. Now, what to do about this? Now, I'm being realistic over here. I'm not being pessimistic, being realistic. I don't see the Western world as some of these other westernized countries in the world giving up this toxic individualism anytime soon. And don't even mention the issue of abortion because a lot of women go crazy and lose their mind or even mention that. I mean, if you want a bigger population, then obviously it's the women that will have to participate in bringing forth this bigger population. But then the issue comes, no, but the woman's right to do with the body whatever she wants. Well, if you want to maintain this in the law, they also have to put up with your population being sabotaged now. If a portion of the women refuses to participate in having bigger families, you have to choose a struggle in this case. Are you going to struggle with the declining population, or are you going to struggle with uh, women against their own will participating in the overall well-being of the population growth? You have to choose a struggle. And the Western world doesn't want to pick a struggle. They just want it all to go away magically, and it will not go away magically. It cannot go away magically. So what I see happening is that the Western world will decline in population, especially the European population will decline. And a lot of the whitewashed people in the world are going to be upset with this also. So there's going to be a more increase in Islamophobia. But meanwhile, the Muslim youths will fight back by becoming more financially and economically relevant and dominant. And before you know it, the Western world will become more and more Islamic, maybe not politically, but culturally. And sooner or later, the whole idea of the West will be some joke of the past that's not even funny. That's what I foresee happening right now. Now, I can be wrong. Sudden change can happen, but as far as I can see, none of these right wing, quote unquote, leaders in the West ever addressed the declining birth rate in an effective way and came up with a solution to make the culture sustainable and to move forward in a constructive way. As a matter of fact, a lot more people are becoming populistic and fascistic right now, lashing out against anything that reminds them of the reality they want to avoid. Now, why did I do this live stream explaining this? Because it's important to call things out when they're happening. Oh, and by the way, the term um, white people is something that was invented in the 17th century. Okay? In the English colonies, there was all the distinction between the Christians and the non-Christians. But the thing is that a lot of a lot of the English settlers were not wealthy, and they were often doing indentured labor. It was not slave labor, but they were exploited too when it came to labor. Not as much as the enslaved Africans were, but yet European settlers that went to the colonies and they were suppressed also by their own European elite back in Europe and some of the relatives of those European elites in the colonies. So what happened was that the European colonial powers needed to solidify loyalty from their own subjects. So they came up with the idea to categorize their their diaspora as one group that needs allegiance to one another. Okay, let me read this for you. Okay. Okay, in this article, let's read. Um, okay, it says here that The Europeans that settled there had some privileges religiously, enslaved Africans did not. But let's read over here. Africans enjoyed no such privilege. They were understood to be infidels and thus the perpetual enemies of Christian nations, which made it legal to hold them as slaves. By 1640 or so, the raw treatment of indentured servants had started to diminish the supply of Europeans willing to work on the sugar and tobacco plantations, and so the colonists looked increasingly to slavery and the Atlantic-sized loophole that enabled it to keep their fantastically profitable operations supplied with labor. The plantation owners understood very well that their cruel treatment of indentured Europeans and their even crueler treatment of enslaved Africans might lead to thoughts or worse of vengeance. Significantly outnumbered, they lived in constant fear of uprisings. Well, rightfully so, if you mistreat people like that. They were particularly afraid of incidents such as Bacon's rebellion in 1676, which saw indentured Europeans fighting side by side with free and enslaved Africans against Virginia's colonial government. Today you have the Commonwealth of Virginia, and you have Virginia as a state of the United States, and you also have West Virginia, that later separated from Virginia. But Virginia back then was an English colony, later British colony. And in 1676 there was this rebellion where European settlers fought side by side with the enslaved and freed Africans. And the colonial authorities didn't want this to happen again. Okay. To ward off such events, the plantation owners initially sought to protect themselves by giving their Christian servants legal privileges not available to their enslaved Negroes. The idea was to buy off the allegiance of indentured Europeans with a set of entitlements that, however meager, set them above enslaved Africans. Towards the end of the 17th century, this scheme witnessed a significant shift. Many of the laws that regulated slave and servant behavior, the 1681 Servant Act of Jamaica, for example, which later copied for use in South Carolina and began to describe the privileged class as whites and not as Christians. One of the more plausible explanations of this change, made by Rugemer and historian Catherine Gerbner, among others, is that the establishment of whiteness as a legal category solved a religious dilemma. By the 1670s, Christian missionaries, including the Quaker George Fox, were insisting that enslaved Africans should be inducted into the Christian faith. The problem this posed for the planters was obvious. If the African laborers became Christians and no longer perpetual enemies of Christendom, then on what legal grounds could they be enslaved? And what about the colonial laws that gave special privileges to Christians, laws whose authors apparently never contemplated the possibility that Africans might someday join the faith? The planters tried to resolve the dilemma by blocking the conversion of enslaved Africans on the grounds, as the Barbados Assembly put it in 1680, that such conversions would endanger the island inasmuch as converted Negroes grow more perverse and intractable than others. But anyway, I'm not going to read the whole thing. So the term white people, here you have 1681, that was the term was invented. Europeans never referred to themselves like that. And the term white people actually meant someone that was financially approved. So if you were a settler, they didn't care about your skin color or your actual background. If you were a settler in the colonies and you were financially approved, you were considered white. If you were not approved or were just from African descent, you were considered black. Now there were those from African descent that were labeled as white also because they were financially approved. So that's where it comes from. So Europeans should be called Europeans. The term white people is not an actual term that refers to any actual nation or ethnicity. Now it's used in public discourse, like I just used it also by accident in this live stream, when I know where it comes from. It's a legal term referring to financial approval. Well, as a matter of fact, most Europeans today would even fit this criteria of whiteness to begin with. But unfortunately, late in the 19th century, like 2 centuries after this whiteness thing became a religious thing culturally. And the European leaders, well, leaders, I know how you call these people, they abused this whiteness hoax to exploit and take advantage of their own European population. Anti-black racism did exist earlier, that came from the Dutch Empire that labeled Africans as swamp monsters called niggers. And nigger or necker or nixie is a swamp monster used to be worshipped in the Netherlands. So just know that anti-black racism and apartheid were already there, but the whiteness thing to get Europeans on board with this developed slowly later on. So that's also something that needs to be unlearned. But okay, I hope this live stream helps you out to realize what's going on right now in the world. Look, there is no easy solution for this. And this channel is for believers that follow Christ. So I say to all believers over here, look, stay out of this um, worldly mess as much as possible. Focus on serving the Heavenly Father. I'm not telling you to neglect the community or act like there are no issues around you. Just don't get involved in these useless fights with the world. Okay? Keep walking by faith, and I'll see you next time. Be at peace.